Welcome back. This is News Extra. Now, it's been a fairly mixed time for the Lib Dems here in Norfolk of late. In the election last year, up in North Norfolk, Norman Lamb, he held on to his seat, whereas some others across the country were losing theirs. It wasn't so good, of course, in Norwich South, though, as Simon Wright lost his seat as MP to Labour's Clive Lewis. The Lib Dems were, of course, very pro-European during the EU referendum, but could that stance win them back support in a future election? And could they once again find themselves with a second MP here in Norfolk? Well, tonight I'm joined by Tim Farron, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Good evening, Tim.
Good evening, thanks for having us.
Now, when you're going around the country, I guess Europe is coming up an awful lot. I know you're doing a question and answer session here in Norfolk. Is it a subject that people are still talking about for you?
Yes, they are. I think, however, what we talked about in the run-up to the referendum was all hypotheticals. Was it going to be a damaging thing for the United Kingdom, an opportunity for the United Kingdom? And all of us had our strong views, but now it's becoming something which is a reality. The government has a narrow mandate, 52-48, to negotiate an exit from the European Union, but I would argue, and I think most people would argue, that they didn't have a mandate to go and cut us off completely from our neighbours, particularly when it comes to the single market, which, let's remember, was Margaret Thatcher's great legacy. And the impact, I suppose, of leaving the single market begins to have sort of pretty big day-to-day bread and butter consequences for us. So the prices of the petrol pumps already going up and likely to go up by another 5p in the next few days. The prices on the shop shelves, supermarket shelves, going up, and what it might mean for orders and indeed the future of businesses large and small across the UK. So those things become more serious and more live as people see that, you know, the phony war is beginning to end and something a lot more tangible is beginning to happen.
Well, because Norwich as a city itself was a Remain city. Norfolk as large voted to leave. Looking at that, does that give you hope that the Lib Dems can make progress if you continue with a very pro-European stance in the city and winning votes back there?
Well, first of all, trying to kind of relive the referendum would be a foolish thing to do, and it would be to let the British people down, because there are new challenges as a result of the referendum, and indeed other things like the attempt to go very much backwards towards selective secondary education and to underfund the National Health Service and so on. Those are challenges that the government needs to be held to account for, and the Labour Party clearly aren't doing that at the moment. So we need to step into that space and be the decent, strong opposition. But of course, the fact that the Liberal Democrats were bold and principled, stuck to our guns through the referendum, didn't go in for Project Fear, but actually talked about Project Hope, about how being part of the biggest market on the planet and the most successful peace process in probably modern history were good things. But having lost the referendum, that belief that Britain should still be an outward-looking, decent, tolerant country, open and united, they're still things we believe and still things that can be true, whether Britain is in or out of the European Union. And so it seems to me that with our massive increase in membership since June, winning by-elections, including here, of course, in Norfolk, 2 wins since the referendum, and in places that actually voted to leave, shows you that what's happening is the Liberal Democrats are having a bit of a rebirth, a revival, as people see as the decent opposition to a Tory government that's currently getting away without scrutiny.
Because if you were a betting man, would you put money on an election next year?
I'm not a betting man, but I follow the markets because it's always an interesting way to see how things are going. I would give you 4-1 against there being an election next year, so possible but not likely.
Now, considering those odds, how would you rate the Lib Dems' chances of actually making gains again in Norfolk? Because obviously there were 2 MPs here,
yeah. Now
one, just Norman Lamb in North Norfolk. Do you think the chances are good?
Well, naming numbers is always a stupid thing to do, so I won't do that. But my sense is that a general election, whenever it would come, particularly sooner, but whenever it comes, we'd be very confident of going forward in. Interestingly, if you look at the electoral position around the country, how can the Conservatives lose their majority and lose their ability to inflict cuts on our health service and divisive selection within secondary education, and to undo all the great work that the Liberal Democrats did in government on protecting our environment and fighting climate change? How could they possibly lose? Well, nobody believes that the Labour Party will gain a single seat off the Tories under Jeremy Corbyn. The SNP are only capable of getting 1 seat off the Tories because that's all they've got left in Scotland, which means the only plausible route for a government that is not Conservative and without a Tory majority is for the Liberal Democrats to make those gains, not just here in East Anglia, but across the country, particularly in those suburban and semi-rural areas where we have been strong. So I think we are the only plausible way.
So you see yourself as the main opposition, particularly in Norfolk?
I think we're the only plausible way of the Tories not running the country in the foreseeable future.
Now, looking at some of the boundary changes that are being looked at, particularly in this part of the country, Norwich South is one of those that could be altered. North Norfolk, again, another Lib Dem area. They could potentially become more Tory friendly, it's been argued, by looking at how some of those boundaries change. Does that concern you at all with some of those movements?
No, I mean, if you look at the boundary changes in Norfolk, I think they're actually moderately helpful to us, but that's not really the reason that you should take a position one way or the other on boundary changes. The question is it right for the government to impose those changes now when the electoral register is a couple of years out of date? There are lots of people, particularly young people, who come onto the roll in the last 2 years who are not going to be included on the figures on which those boundaries are drawn. That seems very anti-democratic, and the government really ought to go back to the drawing board.
So you think that needs to be done for the system to really work properly?
Honestly, if we're going to be fair and include everybody, I mean, one of the good things about the referendum is you had the highest turnout of under 24-year-old voters in the history of British politics, and that's something we should be really proud of. But those people who registered to vote in this remarkably important referendum that we had in June, the thought that they are going to be excluded from the numbers that decide what those boundaries look like seems very, very wrong.
Now, looking at Norwich South, obviously Simon Wright lost his seat last year. It seems a very long time ago now. Lots happened since then. What does the Lib Dems have to do to win those voters back that have deserted the party?
Well, I think what we've got to do now, and I think what is very clear, is provide the only decent alternative to the Conservatives that there is. The reality is the SNP can't gain more than a handful of seats, 2 or 3 more seats than they've already got. So they're out of the picture in terms of being a national force. They don't stand in more than 7.5% of the seats in the United Kingdom. That leaves us with the Conservative Party getting away with a hard Brexit that nobody voted for. Even if you voted to leave the European Union, people didn't vote for a complete severance from the single market, and therefore an economic downturn that is totally avoidable and which will affect the jobs and the livelihoods of everybody in Norfolk. They're also, of course, taking away money from our National Health Service and forcing divisive selection on secondary education, and there needs to be a decent opposition to that. And in the absence of a proper Labour Party in opposition, they're merely interested in fighting amongst themselves, then the Liberal Democrats step into that space, and that gives us the great opportunity to go forward. It's why, over the last, 3 months, the Liberal Democrats have made a staggering 19 gains in council by-elections around the country. And when I say that's staggering, remember the party that's done second best has made 1 gain since June.
But with what is now a relatively limited number of people in the party in Parliament, is it possible to be that credible opposition? Is that difficult?
Well, look, I mean, I'd say 2 things. First of all, my colleague, Liberal colleague in Canada, Justin Trudeau, was in 3rd place with a very small number of seats, a year and a half ago, and he's now the Prime Minister of Canada because he looked at a right-wing Conservative government that was damaging Canada's reputation in the world and damaging Canada's economy, and you saw a frankly useless second party, a Labour Party, and he chose to leapfrog it, and he is now, as I say, the Prime Minister. Let's look more close to home and see that just 2 years ago the SNP had just 6 seats, and now Scotland, sadly in my view, is a one-party state. It just shows you how quickly and dramatically things can change when there is a need for something better, and we intend to be that thing that is better.
And you feel that people will respond to that, even though that the party is in the weakened state?
You've got to be ambitious. I mean, let's remember our party membership over the last year, particularly since the referendum, has rocketed in size. We are now bigger than we've been at any time this century, bigger even than we were at the height or even the depths of the Iraq War that Charles Kennedy led us through so nobly, fighting against that war. But the real movement that's happened over this last 3 months has been absolutely staggering. So our size is bigger than it's been in 2 decades, and our strength in local elections is bigger than it's been for almost a decade. So we should be very proud and encouraged by that. But the reality is Britain needs a decent, strong opposition to the Conservatives. No one else is going to do it. It better be us.
A confident way to end. Tim, thank you very much indeed. That is all the time we have for this evening as ever. You can always join the conversation on Twitter. We are @MustardTV. The hashtag is NewsExtra. My thanks to Tim Farron and to you for watching. Have a very good night.